Good morning, and a warm welcome to the ninth episode of Cap League Insight series. Our topic for today's discussion is residence and citizenship planning. As globalization has expanded, residence and citizenship have become topics of interest among the increasing number of internationally mobile entrepreneurs and investors. A growing number of countries host residence and citizenship by investment programs. These are also known as golden visa programs that offer a variety of investment options designed to cater to different families' unique needs. In an unsettled, ever-changing world, wealthy individuals need a plan B for themselves and their families, one that offers them a safer place to live in times of crisis, while also providing them with greater access to global business and lifestyle opportunities. Investing in different residence and or citizenship options worldwide offers both a short-term value and long-term yield. The more access you have, the more diversified your assets and lower your exposure to regional and global volatility. To discuss the concept and issues related to residence and citizenship planning, we have the pleasure of having with us today Nirbhay Handa, Managing Director, Private Clients, Henley and Partners, India. For over 20 years, Henley and Partners have been global leaders in residence and citizenship planning. They specialize in advising high net worth individuals and their families with gaining residence or citizenship by assisting them to complete qualifying investments in the country of choice. They also have a government advisory practice in which they provide assistance to governments for the designing and implementation of investment-related migration programs. Now, investment migration is also becoming an important aspect for Indian high net worth individuals. This helps families, individuals in terms of wealth preservation, portfolio diversification, estate succession planning, and for some of them, it also helps them with their business objectives. Requirements by Indian HNIs, global NRIs has gone up for residence by investment and citizenship by investment advisory services over the last several years, and more so in the last year in the pandemic situation. So welcome, Nirbhay. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Sapna. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So before we start the discussion, I'd like to mention that we'll have a 10-minute Q&A towards the end. Please type your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screens and address it to the panelists. So Nirbhay, I request you to start by giving us an overview about what your organization does, the concept of residence and citizenship planning, what are the advantages, what are the challenges? So over to you.
Hey, thank you, Sapna, and it's great to meet you all today. So Henley and Partners, as Sapna mentioned, is the industry leader in citizenship and residence planning. We only do one thing, which is helping you with your citizenship and residence planning. Our target audience is usually high net worth families on one side, but we also work with governments on the other side as well. And as an organization, we've been retained by more than 14 governments worldwide, and we've been able to raise FDI in excess of more than 9 billion so far for various governments. I'm based in Singapore. I cover the India business. I obviously travel very often to India, but particularly because of the pandemic for the last 18 months, I've not been able to travel. India has been a really interesting market for investment migration. Historically, most of the investment migration in India was centered around the US. But in the last, I would say 2-3 years, Indians are also becoming receptive to other opportunities within the investment migration space. We've seen a significant amount of interest from Indian families. As a result of that, we decided to have an onshore presence. So we have 7 people on ground across major cities in India: Mumbai, Delhi, and Bangalore. We also have Rohit from New Delhi, who's joined us in the call. And again, we feel that India as a market is going to grow drastically when it comes to investment migration, because Indian families are increasingly looking to diversify their wealth. and alternative residence serves a very meaningful purpose in order for them to do so. So that's a generalistic overview on what I do and what Henley and Partners does. I'll be very happy to answer any other questions, Sapna, that you may have.
Yeah, so starting with the topic at hand today, if you could
Yeah.
summarize for us, what is the key difference between residence and citizenship by investment?
Great. I think that's a really good question. And I think it's very important to understand in the Indian context, right? So, India does not allow dual citizenship. What that means is if you were to get another citizenship, you have to renounce the Indian passport. But on an Indian passport, you can have multiple residencies. That's not an issue at all, right? So, the key difference between residence and citizenship is when you get a citizenship, you actually get a passport of that jurisdiction, right? So, you have a physical passport and at that stage, you have to renounce the Indian passport. But when you get a residency, you get a residency card of that jurisdiction, or you get a stamp on your passport for the residency of that country. So that's one of the key differences. The other difference is citizenship usually can be passed on to future generations. Residency cannot. Citizenship also gives you the right to vote. Residency usually does not do that. Let's say if you were to get an EU citizenship, right, it also gives you settlement freedom to live across the European Union, whereas residency of an EU country or a Schengen state only gives you the travel freedom. So these are key differences between a citizenship and residency. So just summarizing that, on an Indian passport, you can have multiple residencies, right? But if you were to acquire another citizenship, then you have to renounce the Indian citizenship, which ends up being a bit of a daunting affair. And particularly domiciled Indian families are not particularly keen to do so, right? Hence why our major business in India remains residence by investment.
Now, when you talk about residence by investment, so give us an overview of how the investment migration landscape has changed in India over the last few years.
Yeah, I think great question, and it's changed drastically. Investment migration market in general is quite buoyant in India. Historically, most of the investment migration in India was centered around people wanted to physically move, right? That's why Canada, US, Australia, they were really popular. But now we're seeing a rise of investment migration, which is for the purpose of building resilience, having a bit of a plan B, which was not the case historically. The second piece is India has been a great place for wealth creation, right? But now high net worth families are looking outwards from a wealth preservation point of view. So they're looking at Singapore, London, Zurich, because these places offer a tenacious banking infrastructure and they have a lot more longevity. And as a result of that, families are looking into it. So the second reason why a lot of investment migration is happening is because of the wealth preservation piece, right? The third difference I would say is historically, obviously when I was also very young, as a parents always want us to go study in the US. It's a fairly merit-based environment in the US. They have great educational infrastructure. But now what we're seeing is education in Europe is also becoming fairly bilingual, right? And you have great boarding schools in Switzerland. You have great universities in Europe, for example, IMD, IE in Spain, INSEAD. So as the education in Europe has become more bilingual, and it also tends to be a lot more affordable than the US, the whole charm of EU is becoming more profound, particularly amongst the Indian family. So I would say these are the three key changes that we've seen within the investment migration landscape in India. When I used to come 5 years ago in India, people were not willing to look at anything else apart from the US or Canada or possibly Australia. But we've seen that completely change in the last 2 years.
Yeah, now that you mention it, I can think of number of my friends, families where the kids are today studying in Germany or Spain, which earlier was virtually unheard of. So
Yeah, absolutely.
considering, yeah, so I
Please.
think language was a barrier earlier, and now, as you mentioned, it's bilingual. Sorry, you were saying something.
Yeah, and I think personal example, my family made me take the SATs 4 times because they wanted me to go to an Ivy League, which eventually I did not get in. But I think US was the only option for families back in the day. But now, families are becoming receptive to European education now.
So, what are the key triggers that you have seen in your experience by which families would consider an investment migration program?
Yeah, I think the most important point is I think there has been in general a rise of cosmopolitan and transnational mindset amongst Indian families, right? They are looking outwards, and if they can get a residency while they diversify their wealth through a means of a fund or real estate, that's an add-on, right? So I think the number one reason would be families are becoming more globalized and they are thinking outwards, right? A lot of them have actually lived abroad, they've come back to India, and they still want that comfort that, hey, if I want to spend my retirement somewhere in a landscape part of Greece, I should be able to do that, right? So I think the rise of transnational and cosmopolitan mindset has been quite pivotal, driving interest around these programs. The second part is that, Sapna, any uncertain event around the world, whether that's the pandemic or whether that could be an unrest, for example, in Hong Kong, we had recently elections in the US. The nature of what we do, the interest around programs, it increases, right? Because families realize that, we are living in a fairly volatile macro environment. And if we can give our children at least a second residency, we are helping them in future by giving them more opportunities, right? So I would say that would be the second trigger. The third trigger is now let's look at places like Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, Bangalore. Real estate is quite expensive, right? Mumbai is one of the most expensive real estates in the world. But now, if you were to compare that with places like Greece or Portugal, you'd find real estate is much more affordable, right? So in a place like Mumbai, you would struggle to buy anything for 250,000 euros. But in Greece, you could possibly get a luxury apartment with that and also get a Schengen residency with it, which gives you complete visa-free access to the Schengen zone. So you could be on an Indian passport with a Greek Schengen residency, and tomorrow you decide, hey, I want to fly to Spain. You can go to Spain without a visa. You can fly to Switzerland because they have an agreement with the Schengen states, and you could just move around wherever you want in the European Union. So I think that would be what do you get for the money you're spending in India compared to what you get outside. I think that's also been a fairly important reason why families are looking at these options. So if I hear somebody saying, "Hey, I want to buy a holiday home in Goa or Kerala," the natural instinct is to say, "Hey, why don't you look at Malta? Why don't you look at Spain? Why don't you look at Greece?" The kind of process that you have to go through is kind of similar, but at the same time, you're giving your children an additional residency, a new option, right? So I think these would be the three key triggers that we see day in and day out, why families are looking at these options.
And also, when you talk of EU, there's a huge difference between something like a Sweden or a Switzerland vis-a-vis Portugal or Greece in terms of affordability, in terms of the kind of lifestyle. You could have a villa on the seaside, right? I mean,
Yeah,
earlier.
absolutely. In definitely in Greece, near Athens, 20, 30 minutes from Athens, you get a stunning property for 250,000 euros. And a lot of our clients, they have bought these holiday homes across Crete, Corfu, in Greece. People have looked at Faro district in Portugal, Porto. So I think these places are becoming very popular.
So, when we look at the entire global landscape, like you said, different countries have different programs, different plus points, different challenges. So, among the Indian families in the last few years, which are the programs that you see are more popular?
Yeah, so I think with India, one thing that we need to be really mindful, and obviously anybody who's looking to pursue these programs, you must speak to Sapna and the team, particularly around being compliant with RBI, right? And that's really crucial, particularly if you look at the US, the EB5 threshold, it is not RBI compliant. You can't transfer that wealth from India unless you have wealth offshore. So the first thing that you need to get in place is work closely with your wealth advisor, and understand what are the RBI requirements, right? So, in the wake of RBI requirements, the most popular program for us in India has been the Portugal Golden Visa, right? Because you could use the March and April arbitrage and transfer to 80,000 euros very easily, right, by the book. And on that basis, you can make an acquisition of a property in Portugal and also get a residency in Portugal. All you need to do is spend 7 days a year in Portugal, right? And in the fifth year, in the fifth year, you can apply for a permanent residence or a citizenship. So let's say, it's a big leap of faith for you to consider renouncing the Indian citizenship, and it's not an easy decision, right? You say, hey, I'm not certain, so let me just go for Portugal, apply for a residency. I'll wait and watch the situation for the next 5 years, see if I really want to be in India. If I don't, then I'll apply for the Portuguese citizenship in the fifth year and have that backup option to move in an OCI card. So Portugal has been quite popular because it's much more affordable compared to the US, faster processing time. It only takes 6 to 8 months compared to US EB5 will take you 3 to 5 years, right? And the third most important aspect is US is really invasive on your wealth structuring and your taxation because apart from US and Eritrea are the two countries where you get taxed on the basis of residency and citizenship. Whereas most of the European countries, they practice something called resident non-domicile tax, so your global income is untouched, right? Whereas US, if you're doing the US EB5, it's really important that you speak to your wealth advisor, understand what are the tax implications you're going to be going through. So a lot of the families that we work with, they don't want to get into those complications. Hence, the European options become quite popular. So Portugal was the number one for us last year. Then we did a lot of Greece. We've had a lot of families from New Delhi who have embraced the idea of retiring in Greece or having a beautiful holiday home in Greece. And the third most popular program for us has been the Australian Global Talent Independent Visa. So we've had the special envoy of the Prime Minister of Australia reach out to us, and we're working on identifying some really high caliber tech entrepreneurs who can get awarded the Australian PR in just a span of 4 to 6 months, right? And a lot of entrepreneurs, particularly from places like Hyderabad, Bangalore, Mumbai, who've seen some exits in their startup and they're keen to take their businesses global. They're really embracing the idea of Australia Global Talent Independent Visa. As you know, Australia is also making, they're putting a lot of work particularly around helping these tech entrepreneurs raise funds through private equity and venture capital. So a lot of Indian entrepreneurs are looking outwards for those reasons as well, right? So that would be the third most popular program for us amongst resident Indians. But now, obviously, Rohit, who's on the call, has been our Latvia specialist. So we've had a lot of Indian families who've had the opportunity to work with Rohit Bhardwaj, who's based in New Delhi, acquire residency in Latvia. It's quite straightforward. So all you need to do is spend 50,000 euros, put it in a startup, and you get a Latvian residence, which gives you visa-free access across the Schengen zone. Now, we're also getting a lot of interest around getting a Maltese residency. As you know, Malta is the yachting capital of the world. It's the epicenter of fintech in Europe. It's 2.5, 3 hours by ferry from Sicily. Really a beautiful part of the Mediterranean. All you need to do is incur a sunk cost of around 100,000 euros, which is LRS compliant, and you can get a residency in Malta. So I would say these are the most important programs for domiciled Indian families where we see a lot of interest. We do see interest around the citizenship by investment programs, but it's not a lot in India because it's very hard. Indian families, they find it really difficult to give up the Indian passport, right? But if you're a non-resident Indian, it becomes slightly easier because you have limited ties with India. You've been living in Dubai, UK for a long time. So the citizenship by investment programs tend to be more popular for non-resident Indians.
So the Australian program that you spoke about, that is specifically only focused on tech entrepreneurs?
Yeah, so the Australian program is open for tech entrepreneurs. It's also open for extraordinary C-level executives in interesting industries. So let's say if you're a C-level executive in fintech, right? Let's say you're a C-level executive in pharmaceuticals. Let's say you are on the forefront of data analytics, AI, robotics. So these industries are really sought after. So we're open to entrepreneurs, but we're also open to C-level executives who are working for great corporations, who would like to make their next move to Australia.
So they're basically trying to import intellectual capital.
Exactly. So I think this program. One of the reasons why it's come into play is because this is the strategy that Australia has incorporated to recover from the pandemic. So they feel if they're able to retain and attract high caliber talent, it's going to give a huge boost to their economy, right? And as a result of that, this program has come into play.
So Nirbhay, you touched upon the US EB5 program. And we have a number of clients whose kids are studying there or families settled there. So I'd like you to elaborate a little bit more briefly about the US EB5 program, and also just touch upon, I know there have been some changes in June this year. So very briefly, what it was prior to June and what it is now.
Yeah, so EB5 has been, I would say, a very popular program amongst Indian families for a fairly long time now. Historically, the investment threshold that we were looking at was 500,000 for a passive investment, right? That got raised to 900,000. But then there was a news that it's again back to 500,000 for a small window. So what happens with US is you need to work very closely with a US registered lawyer who can give you up-to-date sort of information on how things are at that particular moment, right? So there have been slight inconsistencies around the messaging of what's happening, particularly with the US EB5. In summary, US EB5 takes about 3 to 4 years for Indian nationals, right? You are able to get a green card through it, but then you need to ensure that you receive sound tax advice from a tax lawyer and your wealth advisor, because your global income can be taxed as a result of it, right? Also, if you are banking with particularly a Swiss bank, you come under the laws of FATCA. So you have to be really careful and take sound advice before you do anything with the US, right? And the third piece is the regional centers in the US, which is part of the passive investment. They are a fairly commoditized space. So it's really important that you do your due diligence thoroughly, because a lot of people have been burnt when it comes to any ROIs that they were expecting to receive in these regional centers, right? So as a result of that, we work with a very reliable US registered immigration lawyer, and he does extensive due diligence on regional centers that we feel our clients would be comfortable with, because for us, it's a huge reputational issue if there are any issues around, because we work with a lot of governments. So as a business, our approach is really conservative, and we don't really subject our clients to a lot of risk, right? And that's why the options of these regional centers with a business like us would be quite limited, because most of them, they don't qualify our due diligence. So, long story short, it was historically 500,000, which went to a passive investment through a regional center, the most popular way. It went to 900,000, but there is still a window at 500,000, which obviously needs to be confirmed with a US registered lawyer. And if it is, then you can apply for a US EB5. Your waiting time is going to be 3 to 5 years for an Indian national. And you could also possibly get a green card at the back of it.
You mentioned earlier for places like Portugal that you have to spend something like 5-7 days in a year. What about other countries like US? Once you are in the EB5 program, are there some stipulations on the number of days that you need to spend there?
So obviously, the main applicant and the family members are recommended to stay in the US, right?
Okay.
So they obviously want you to be legal tax residents of the US, right? So that's what the recommendation they do. In case you're not doing that, then you need to seek advice from an US registered immigration lawyer on what consequences it could have on their residency. So yeah, it's obviously recommended that you spend time in the US.
Uh, just going back to taking residence in a Greece, Portugal, or Malta, any of these countries, the tax status doesn't change. We still file our returns in India, and our global income gets totaled up if we are doing business overseas, exactly the same way if we had not taken the residence?
Yeah, so one thing that we need to understand, we're not tax experts, but I can give you a general overview. And before you do anything with tax, you should always speak to a tax lawyer or your wealth advisor. But the general rule of thumb is that if you're not spending 180 days in this jurisdiction, then you're not a tax resident of that country. So most of our clients who have a Malta or a Portuguese residency, they continue to be Indian tax residents. They're not spending that kind of time themselves in these jurisdictions. So nothing on the tax on the wealth structuring front is impacted as a result of it, right?
Okay.
But when you start spending more than 180 days in that jurisdiction, let's say Malta, then you need to look at the double taxation agreement between the jurisdictions, right? What implications it could have on your worldwide income, right? Places like the UK and Malta and Portugal, they have a structure called resident non-domiciled tax, which gives you a number of exemptions, but it's a fairly comprehensive topic that should be discussed in detail with a tax lawyer if you are going to spend more than 180 days in that
Okay.
country.
So Nirbhay, we also have number of NRI clients based in US, UK, Dubai, Singapore. So just looking at things from their perspective, can you give us some idea in your experience in the last few years for the NRIs? What are the kind of programs which have been more popular?
So, we've seen a lot of non-resident Indians are looking at the citizenship by investment route, right? And the reason for that is they've been away from India for a long time. They have limited ties with India, right? And every now and then you do get some news around, obviously it's not confirmed, but it creates a little bit of concern amongst 100% Indian families that India may eventually start taxing you on the basis of citizenship, like the US. You never know, right? And obviously, India took a slightly proactive stance with the tax tiebreaker rule with UAE. So a lot of very wealthy Indian entrepreneurs based in UAE, they were seriously concerned whether, they've been living in UAE for the last 30, 40 years. They have limited or no ties to India. And just by virtue of them being UAE tax residents, there's a possibility that they may have to pay tax in India, right? So as a result of that, that did sort of trigger a little bit of interest around citizenship by investment programs, where a lot of Indian families were looking at acquiring a citizenship in places like Malta or Montenegro. A lot of Indian families also looked at opting for citizenship by investment options in the Caribbean, but these are families who've been living away from India for a long time, right? So Malta is in Malta, you could acquire a Maltese citizenship in a span of 18 months through a process of naturalization, which is based on a donation. So you have to donate around 750,000 euros to the government of Malta, and then you can become an EU citizen. So I'll give you an example. I had a family from UAE. They acquired a Maltese citizenship. They renounced the Indian passport. They got an OCI card eventually, and now they live in Geneva because now they're EU citizens. One of their child goes to university for free in Sweden because now he's an EU citizen. The other one is an engineer in Berlin. So all of this has come together because now they have EU citizenship and they have complete settlement freedom across the EU, right? So we've had a lot of Indian families who've been in Singapore for 20, 30 years. They've also embraced the idea of getting a European citizenship. There are a lot of non-resident Indian families who, let's say, hold a permanent resident status in Singapore, Hong Kong, and they decide they need a citizenship which allows them to travel more freely. So a lot of them have opted for a citizenship in places like St. Lucia in the Caribbean, which gives them that visa-free access as well, right? So I also had an example where I had a non-resident Indian lady who was based in the Middle East. She was Before that she was living in Singapore, but she moved to Middle East and she was getting treated for a serious health ailment in Singapore, right? And she wanted to come in and out of Singapore seamlessly, right? And on Indian passport, it was quite troublesome for her. So she decided that she would get a citizenship in St. Lucia and she could come to Singapore visa free, get treated at the Mount Elizabeth Hospital here, and go back to UAE. So people come to us for quite interesting reasons. I've had a family from New Delhi. They wanted to send their child to a football training school in Portugal. Hence, they acquired a Portuguese residency. We've had clients who are India has a fairly, I would say, a growing yachting culture, and obviously Malta is the yachting capital of the world. So we've had families from India who said, "Hey, we would like to dock our yachts in Malta when we have them. So maybe let's look at a Maltese residency. We've worked very hard in our lives. Now we're 65. We want to cruise around the Mediterranean, and this is what we want to do, right?" So people come to us for very interesting reasons. It could be sometimes healthcare, it could be lifestyle, and sometimes it could also be business. For example, in Malta is really becoming the fintech capital of Europe. There's lots of stuff that's happening around the blockchain space as well. So there are these young Indian entrepreneurs with, I would say, a lot of focus on blockchain, and they are looking at places like Malta, which seems to be a very thriving jurisdiction embracing the whole concept of blockchain.
Okay. So, could you give us an example? You've shared some examples, but one example right from beginning to the whole process. Why a family? What are the triggers they came up with? What was the process and their final journey till they finally got a residence? What are the whole bits and pieces in the entire journey?
Yeah, so let me give you an example. So I had a C-level executive from New Delhi. I met the gentleman, I would say 2 years ago, right? And he was in his 60s, right? And he said, "Hey, Nirva, I just want to buy a beautiful home in Greece, and my kids are all well settled in the US, right? I just want to retire with my wife and spend the next 10 years really living a quality of life that I'm missing out on being in Delhi, which is obviously, um, and his concern was to do around pollution, right? He said, "Look, I find this place is not for me anymore. I worked hard. I've got to a certain point in my life." So a lot of people come to us because they have that sort of aspiration to retire somewhere and live that quality of life. So this gentleman did really well, I would say, in a commodities trading organization, and then he acquired a residency in Greece through us. How the process went was first we met him. He legally sort of acquired his accumulated his funds in Singapore in a bank through 2 years of LRS limit, because one thing that you also need to be mindful of is, and this is an RBI law, that you cannot club your funds if the asset is only owned by one person offshore. So he had to wait for 2 years, right? So he transferred 250,000 USD in the first year, 250,000 in the second year, and then he had $500,000 USD. And in the third year, the gentleman decided, "Hey, Nirva, it's the right time. Let me acquire a beautiful home in Greece." We got him a stunning property about 30 minutes from Athens. But before all of that happened, we had to do a due diligence. So he qualified a due diligence, which takes about 2 to 3 weeks. If you have some negative flags, we find it's very hard for us to onboard you, right? So obviously he was a C-level executive. All of the money that he earned was through a corporation. So everything was very good on the source of funds side. And we onboarded him, and then we helped him with a property acquisition. So we have a business called Henley Estates, which does the property piece. He acquired a property. We filed his residency and citizenship application. We filed his residency application, and in 6 to 8 months, the gentleman received his residency card, and now he spends majority of the time in Greece, but obviously travels between Portugal, Spain, every 30, 40 days, because in Europe you can do that. And particularly with the Schengen visa free access, he moves around, and yeah, and he's having a great time. So I think that's usually how a client journey works. It starts off with the due diligence process. We want to understand what is your source of fund, see if everything looks good, and then we can possibly onboard you and then assist you from point A to Z throughout the process. As a business, we have, I would say, very little appetite for risk. So all the projects that we get involved in, they have to go through a multi-layered due diligence check before they can actually be onboarded by Henley and Partners. As government advisors, we need to take this approach. So that's essentially how a process looks. at Henley and Partners. We also had a very interesting case from New Delhi. This family, they wanted to send their kids to, I would say, I think the British or the American school. And, if you are keen to send your kids to those schools, it's required that you have a foreign citizenship at times, right? So we had a family who acquired a foreign citizenship because of that, right? So another interesting reason. And then we've helped a lot of Konkani families acquire a residency in Portugal because there's a huge community of them, right? So we had a group of a few families who came together, and then so I think Portugal has been really popular. Australian talent independent visa is very, very popular. So before we can onboard you for that, we need a statement of interest where we look at your resume, which you've done, and then we go to the government in Australia, have a conversation. The gentleman who runs our Australian office is an ex-diplomat. He was the first secretary to the government of Australia in Austria, a bit of a tongue twister. And then he speaks to the government on our behalf. And once the government says, "Hey, we think this person is great, we endorse him, and he could bring in a lot of value to our tech and innovation ecosystem," then we onboard the gentleman, go through the due diligence, and onboard them for this program, which is called the Australian Global Talent Independent Visa. So that's how usually a client journey looks. But I think the first thing, we have clients who decide to work with us at the outset. So they meet us and say, "Hey, nearby, I have a bunch of properties in Mumbai and Delhi. I don't need so many of them. Let me just put my money in a fund offshore and also get a residency for my children." And then we also have families who take their own time. So there are people that I met 3-4 years ago in India, and now they're starting to work with us. And I think the whole interest has spiked because of the pandemic with the lockdown. So they said, "Hey, nearby, what you were telling us 4 years ago, we didn't realize it at that moment, but when this incident happened, now we see the importance of it," right? So that's also what we see what is happening within the Indian market. So yeah, I think that's in general a very simplified form of the onboarding process with us.
Nirpay, you've mentioned about this due diligence process, right? So you mentioned about source of funds. Are there any other kind of red flags? And what is the extent of due diligence? Typically, would governments look at the last 10 years history, last 15 years history? What all? I assume the due diligence you are doing is because when the papers are forwarded to a particular government, then they do a due diligence and you want to preempt any kind of wrong thing coming out.
No, so I think if there are any negative flags, we would struggle to onboard that person, right? The negative flags could be around tax. The negative flags could be around notices on the company. So if there are any of those flags, it's a clear no. We cannot onboard. And at the same time, if you look at the overall investment migration industry, there's a lot of pressure on the governments to enhance their due diligence, right? So even all these countries, their due diligence process is much more rigorous than what it was 3 to 4 years ago, right? Any country you acquire citizenship, you have to go through all the police clearances, Interpol, FBI checks. Everywhere you've resided in the past 10 years for more than 6 months, you need a police clearance. And it becomes quite hard if you have a negative flag on public media, or if you have a legal proceeding that you're pursuing. I think those usually become areas that we were not able to help those clients at all. Also, as a business, our approach is a lot more conservative because we are government advisors. We design these programs for various governments, and there's a big reputational risk for us. So we only want to represent people with the best of the best pedigrees, with the best of the best backgrounds.
So Nirbhay, I've been reading that other than obviously the ease of a program or the kind of place one would like to be, a lot of people talk about this passport index. So can you elaborate a little what's passport index, what is strength of passport, and generally, what all people look at when they talk about a passport index?
Yeah, great question. So Henley pioneered the passport index. I think it's a reference point for various governments and universities worldwide. So what the passport index does is it ranks different passports on how receptive they are from a travel and mobility point of view, right? And as we all know, Indian passport unfortunately is not the most friendly passport when it comes to travel, right? It's a great jurisdiction. There's a lot of inward investment into India, but from a travel point of view, it is quite restrictive. And global entrepreneurs, they are jet setters. They're moving around from one place to another, and they don't want that hassle of getting visas all the time, right? And they also end up looking at a lot of citizenship options or a residency option, which can enhance their travel freedom. So India is ranked, I would say, not at a very high place. We can only travel to around 60 countries without a visa, right? And for most countries, we do need a visa. So as a result of that, getting a Portuguese residency on your Indian passport can add another 26 jurisdictions where you could travel without a visa. So I think that's why a lot of people look at these programs as well. Another interesting element about the passport index is it's the first time in history that an Asian country has the strongest passport in the world. So that's Japan for you, and then followed by Singapore and Germany. So it's for the first time ever an Asian country has had the strongest passport in the world. So that's quite an interesting revelation. And passport index essentially is a tool which gives you an understanding how many countries can you travel to with a passport of a country. So that's the purpose it serves.
So if I'm holding an Indian passport, which doesn't allow me to go beyond maybe whatever, 50, 60 countries without taking a visa, you are saying
Yeah.
is if I get a residence of Portugal or if I get a residence of Malta, it'll the fact that I have a residence will enable me to go to more countries, which allow residents
Yeah,
of
so
Malta to
absolutely.
travel without visa.
So Malta is part of the Schengen states. So once you have an Indian passport plus you have a Maltese residency, then you can go visa free to Italy, Spain, Portugal,
Okay.
Sweden, Netherlands, wherever you wish to, without applying for a visa. So it becomes also a great tool for mobility, apart from education, healthcare, and obviously giving your children another opportunity in a different jurisdiction. So it has a lot of benefits to it.
Okay. A very basic question. Like you've mentioned, have an Indian passport, take a residence, and then I can travel to maybe 20, 30 more countries. But
26 more
typically,
Schengen states.
okay, so many of us who are enthusiastic travelers, one of the toughest visas to get is Schengen, and they're usually very restrictive. So if you're flying in on a particular day, flying out, there'll be like 1 day extra here, 1 day extra there. So once you have a
Yeah.
residence, is there a restriction on how many days you can spend there?
So there's no restriction on the country of residence. So you could perpetually live in Malta if you have a Maltese residence. But let's say if you're traveling to the Schengen states, then you need to make sure you're not doing more than 90 days.
Okay, okay.
So
So
that's something you need to be mindful of.
okay, we have a question from one of our guests who has requested, can you talk a little bit more about UK and Latvia?
Yeah, sounds good. So I think Rohit, who's based in Delhi, has been doing a lot of UK cases as well for us. How UK works is the most popular program for us is the Tier 1, which requires you to put 2 million GBP into a private banking account in the UK and invest in equities, right? And this investment needs to be maintained over 5 years, right? So that's the UK Tier 1, which is the most popular program for Indian families who already have wealth offshore. But I think the Tier 1 is becomes troublesome because a lot of families, though they may have the wealth in India, they may not have it offshore, right? So it's not possible for them to just to put that 2 million GBP, right, in a private bank account in the UK. The other programs is the overseas representative visa, and
Sorry, I'll just jump in. Sorry to interrupt. So you're
yeah,
mentioning this 2 million and there could be a higher limit for some other country. But as per the LRS, one can open an account and every year transfer and then accumulate and then invest? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, that's how most families do it.
Okay.
And that's the only way to do it, right?
Okay.
But let's say if you don't have that kind of capital lying outside of India through LRS, then you could also look at the the UK Innovator Visa, right? And the Business Overseas Representative Visa, right? Obviously, if you're going for the Innovator Visa, the competition is quite fierce. So you need endorsements from some regulated bodies. We need to see what your business plan is and then qualify whether you would be eligible for this visa or not. The Business Overseas Representative Visa is slightly easier. So you could set up a sister concern of your current corporation that you may be running in India and the UK. And on that basis, you could acquire a residency in the UK. But again, before we can comment on that, we really need to understand the scale of your business, what you're doing, and then only we can advise whether this would work for you or not. Right? So that's the UK. Latvia, as you said, there's an option you could invest in a startup, which is a very low threshold of around 50,000 euros. Or you also have an option to buy a property for 250,000 euros in Latvia. These are the two most popular options. There are also other ways to do it, but this is where most of the families go for. Having said that, the 50,000 euros that you're putting in Latvia is a high risk capital. So as you know, a lot of startups fail. So you need to have a fairly high risk appetite for that amount if you're going for such a low threshold. So I hope that answers your question. And I think you must speak to Rohit. He's done a lot of Latvia cases for us. And I would say the most number of Latvia cases than anybody at Henley. So he's just he's our Latvia expert right now. He's just the right person for you to have a chat with. Yeah, so that's the UK and Latvia. Yeah.
Okay. So Nirpay, just to summarize what you have discussed with us. So basically, to seek residence overseas, either they are countries who want specialists, they could be tech oriented or specialists in some field, and they would like to invite you there, or it is investing in property, or it is investing in certain kind of specified bonds. Those are the three broad categories that are prevalent as of today. Is that right?
Yeah, so there are countries where you could also put this money in a fund, right?
Okay.
There are countries which require you to make a contribution. So in Malta, you have to make a donation. There are countries where you could buy a real estate. There are countries where you could put money in government bonds. So you have, every country has their own specifics around how they structure these programs. And obviously after this presentation, Sapna, I will send you a quick summary of all the programs that you should, if you can, you should forward it to the viewers today. I think they'll find it fairly beneficial.
Sure. So thanks, Nirbhay. That's been quite a comprehensive and insightful session for us. That brings us to the end of our session today. And thank you very much. I'd like to thank all our guests for taking out time on a Saturday morning. Request you all to please take 30 seconds to fill out the feedback form, which will appear on your browser as you exit this webinar. Thank you once again. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend. Take care. Bye-bye.